Welcome to Clarity Lab, where I talk to leading health and science experts to educate, inform, and dismantle misinformation. And if you are a human on this planet in 2025, you probably know what a problem misinformation is. I'm Derek Beres, and Clarity Lab is the official podcast of Cyrus Health, a 501c3 nonprofit I founded to build a free educational platform and curate social media channels that feature experts presenting health and science in a clear and compelling manner. And since we are a nonprofit, all your donations are tax deductible, which helps support our mission. Please visit cyrushealth.org to learn about what we're doing and what we plan to do in the future. And if you can support us, we would greatly appreciate it. Did you hear about the study that proved that vaccines cause you to become an orangutan? Research shows that sucking spirulina straight from the ocean floor can help you to live to be age 250. A recent clinical trial has proven that clouds give you cancer. All right, I'll stop being ridiculous now, but I'm sure that you've seen studies that sound just too good to be true or too outlandish to be true. In fact, one of my hobbies over the last few years of conspirituality is reading the studies that supplements companies post on their websites, and you wouldn't believe how often they don't support their marketing claims or even contradict what they say their products do. Everyone with something to sell wants their products to be supported by research, and so they find proof in places where there's no proof to be found. I wanted to talk to someone about how to read a journal study, and thankfully Dr. Rohin Francis accepted my query. Dr. Francis is a UK-based cardiologist currently working toward a PhD on imaging techniques for acute myocardial infarction at University College London. You might know him as Medlife Crisis online, including his YouTube channel, which has 563,000 subscribers. His tagline is "Good medicine, bad jokes," but I find his videos and posts rather funny. I knew that reading journal studies was something close to his heart, so I wanted to talk to him about how to do that. In this episode, we discuss how he reads a study, the relevance of sample size, why studying supplements is actually really challenging, correlation versus causation, that's a big one, statistics, and preprints. We cram a lot into 25 minutes. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Rohin, I've seen videos where you talk about the importance of reading and understanding clinical studies. As a doctor, you get a study presented to you. How do you read it? Is there a process by which you look at certain things first? What really jumps out at you as being the most relevant portions?
Sure. I guess that's a big question. There's probably not one answer to it, but my approach is, I think it's perfectly reasonable to read the abstract first of all, just to get an idea about what the paper's about. Of course, it goes without saying that you should have access to the full paper before drawing any conclusions, because I think that's a key problem that we see on the internet with people just looking at the abstract and nothing else. I fully appreciate that access to journals is a problem. If it's something that I'm interested in, that what I do is I go straight to the methods. The introduction in a paper is generally preamble, so it can be useful to set the scene, but it generally isn't a sort of material part of the paper that I'm that interested in. But I'll go straight to the method section to see kind of what the structure of the study is. That will tell me initially if it's even worth reading any further. Because if it is some, poorly designed, unblinded, small scale study, then it's just not even worth reading. Genuinely, it's not worth reading. That's not an insult. It just means that the inferences I'm going to get from it are not going to be valuable. They're not going to change what I'm doing. If it seems reasonable, or if it's something that I'm particularly interested just to find out more, then I'll read the rest of the paper. The results section is clearly of key importance. Discussion in most cases I'm not that interested in, but it can be useful, particularly when it's a field I'm less familiar with. Then, the authors will put it into context. But discussion is often where people get a little carried away and start making little sort of, drawing conclusions that may not quite be supported. That sounds quite simple as a general approach, but obviously there's a huge number of things that you need to take into account. And that's, I'm sure, what we'll get into. But suffice to say, just as a preliminary comment, I don't think it's something that you can learn very quickly. I think this takes years to get good at this. And I have been doing it for 20 years. I'm still, think that it's something that I'm learning and could do much better at, particularly when it comes to kind of advanced statistics. That is a real skill in itself. And there's nothing wrong with saying that you have limits of your expertise. I can probably read a cardiology paper at a very high level and analyze all the ins and outs. But if you give me another area of medicine, like psychiatry or obstetrics and gynecology, I'll have some idea, but I won't be able to pick out, hang on, this doesn't quite make sense. This is not accepted clinical practice. So you've got to have a background in the field as well as analytic ability.
One of the things I see often, my focus when reading studies is usually around supplements, because that's something with conspirituality that interests me. There's a lot of misinformation and pseudoscience around supplements. So I want to bring up a few what I find to be red flags. One of them to me is always sample size. To you, what is a good sample size to begin to actually trust the study's findings?
There's no sort of set answer there because, again, it's a deceptively simple question, right? Well, 5 is too few. But if you're studying a very rare condition, or you're looking at a supplement effect on an extremely rare disease, for example, maybe 5 is okay. Generally you'd say that the higher the number, the better, but there's got to be a cutoff. Otherwise, we'd be giving an unrealistic target for journals, for studies to meet, saying everything should have 10,000. And, particularly in my field in cardiology, some of our trials have like 500,000 people in. So it's bigger is better, but you calculate this based on certain pre-test sort of ideas. So what is the likely effect size? Obviously, it depends on what you're looking at. And the problem with supplements and foods, and we're all familiar. I think the starting point that I was going to mention for this whole topic is the average person reading the news. Every day you're confronted with a different story about coffee, red wine, chocolate, and one day it's causing cancer, the next day it's curing cancer. I mean, this has even been looked at. There was a nice paper from a few years ago where they studied like 50 food ingredients, cumin, turmeric, blueberries. They plotted the chart, and all of them crossed into curing and causing cancer, except maybe 2. There are loads of contradictory studies, so that's a alarm bell to begin with. But what that reflects is that these supplements have very small effect sizes. You need to study huge numbers of people with good quality studies to pick out something with a small effect size. And that's why we see all this contradictory data about all these different supplements, because you're actually probably looking at more statistical variability, just random chance. The reason these supplement trials in particular, and why nutrition research has a bad name, which is a little unfair because there is some good science being done there, but why it has a bad name is many of these studies are worthless. They're too small, and they are just not designed well.
One of my hobbies, you can say, is going to supplements manufacturers, and often they will post studies. I go and I read them, which I believe a lot of them post to say, oh, look, there's proof of efficacy, figuring that a lot of people won't take the next step of actually reading it. And one other practice besides small sample sizes I often see is them posting rat studies or in vitro studies of proof of efficacy. Do you see this as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's something that's always missing from the kind of podcast space. I mean, I'm picking on podcasts, but I think they're particularly influential at the moment. Print media they're the original culprits in random tabloids and things. They will say, this new chemical has shown great promise at reducing cancer size, and that any rational person would take that to mean, oh, that means it's reducing the size of cancer in people. But actually, it could be the size of a colony of cancer cells in a petri dish, or, as you said, in animal models. Sometimes this is talked about in a kind of derogatory way. That's not the point. Animal studies, in vitro studies, meaning, petri dish lab-based studies outside the body, are very valuable. They are hypothesis generating. They're the preliminary stages of research. But the process of medical research is multi-step. So that's just a beginning. I feel like the modern media landscape is so shaped by kind of the news cycle and also tech, like there's a new thing coming out every week. and people see the latest iPhone or computers getting better and better, and they assume that there's progress happening in every field exactly the same rate. So you have these people setting up themselves to give medical news on a weekly basis, and they end up having to resort to this low quality data because there simply isn't that much high quality human randomized control trial data coming out. So this has actually been looked at in another nice paper. This was a study where they looked at in high quality preclinical journals. So these are basic science journals. I think it was Nature and Science, really top journals, but these are research findings that are not clinical studies. Clinical studies means in human beings. They analyzed all the kind of promising findings, like this shows great promise between 1979 to 84, and how many of these actually translated into clinical therapies, medications that made it to market, that actually went through every stage and had evidence. And it was, do you want to take a guess?
10%.
1%. And it was basically just one antihypertensive medication. That's the only thing.
Wow.
And I know this from my own experience. My own research in my PhD was, looking at sort of the action of certain things on the heart. And in the lab, it all looked so promising. In our animal models, it looked great. And then when my role was doing it in humans, and it was sadly completely neutral. I have personal pain at this phenomenon, but that is the case, unfortunately. So preclinical trials very important, but you cannot extrapolate even from a mouse model, which seems like it's another mammal. It's just, you cannot draw those conclusions.
We've talked about a few of my personal red flags. What else do you see wrong? And I'm thinking about this from the perspective of someone reading a study or discussion about a study on social media. Maybe it's one of those issues, and then they say, oh, this proves that. What do you think people get wrong most about studies?
I think you put your finger on it there. I think probably the key mistake, there are many, but their key mistake is mistaking correlation for causation, inferring causation. And it sounds totally reasonable, right? You get a study where they looked at 100 people, and all the people that took ice baths had a better marker of health. Let's say, their VO2 max was higher or something like that. That's probably a bit too objective. So it sounds totally reasonable to think, well, these people are taking ice baths and they're fitter than the people who aren't taking ice baths. Or you can substitute this in for some supplement, some milkshake. I fully understand that inference that somebody would draw from that. But you cannot infer causality from an observational study. All you can do is look at associations. So when we say correlation is not causation, we mean there's a correlation. Sure, you've noticed that this metric is better in the people that do ice baths, but you cannot establish that the ice bath is the cause. In fact, it could be reverse causality. It's most likely to be something called confounding. So this is where the groups that are doing different things are not the same. So you can imagine if you took 100 people, the people who are regularly taking ice baths are probably not the typical person. They're probably more into fitness. They're probably particularly health conscious. They may be more affluent, particularly if they've got some ice bath at home. These things cost huge amounts of money. If you're more affluent, you've afford all kinds of other things that are going to make your health better. They may have better quality food. They may work less arduous jobs. All these kinds of factors. I'm just spitballing. But you can immediately see that there are confounding variables, and you cannot correct for that with observational studies. So that's the power of a randomized prospective controlled trial. That's where you take people from the beginning and you assign them randomly to ice bath or no ice bath or whatever you're testing, and you try and match the two populations accurately. But that's really hard to do. These things are difficult and expensive and time consuming. So people rely on sort of just this observational data, which is much easier to do. I think other things are when it comes to statistics. So you can have problems pre-publication, you can have problems with the publication itself, and then you can have problems after the publication. So that's how I tend to kind of think about the general framework. Pre-publication is things like conflicts of interest, which I see a lot of kind of, let's be a little rude, kind of basic level influencers using that as the big gotcha. Like, this is funded by industry. You can't trust it. And look, conflicts of interest are important, absolutely. But they seem to turn a blind eye to the conflicts of interest in the unregulated supplement industry and only seem to care about it when it's in the pharmaceutical industry. But they're important. But you can still look at the trial and how well designed it is and draw useful conclusions. But you have to ask who's doing the trial, what question are they asking, what are they trying to show? So these are the pre-publication. Publication problems, there's a list of biases as long as your arm, all kinds of ones that are to do with bad study design, to do with bad use of statistics, or just chance. And then there's post-publication, which is things like publication bias. And I think that is a really important one. Publication bias is where we see that positive trials are much more likely to be published than negative trials. And this has been shown time and time again. And the reason is that journals aren't just repositories of knowledge. They're also commercial ventures. They want to publish interesting things. So reading a whole bunch of trials saying this substance didn't do anything is not very interesting. So those publications often fall by the wayside. You may get an impression that the published data is a reflection of all the data out there, but the typical jobbing doctor or scientist or anybody only reading the published research is going to get a false impression, because all the negative ones that say this thing didn't work they don't actually make it to the literature. So there's very little you can do about that. I mean, who's going to go looking for the unpublished research?
You mentioned the word pre, and that is one of my questions. How do you feel about this phenomenon of preprints being published, getting out on social media that I've seen pretty much since the pandemic?
Yes, I think they existed pre-pandemic, but not really in the medical space. They were, I think physics and maths and sciences like that have had a history of preprints for a while. But yes, you're right. The pandemic just saw things explode. And my God, I mean, we could do several PhD theses just on pandemic publication and science misinterpretation. I think it's fair to say that there was just an unprecedented explosion of publications coming out. Of course, in that early phase of the pandemic, we were all just very in the dark. So we were looking for any kind of information that was published. But what it really revealed to me is the lack of ability that people have to appraise clinical trials. And again, I include myself in this. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a public health doctor. So some of these trials looking at sort of vast swathes of the population and with all these concepts that we became familiar with later on, the R naught and all these kinds of things. It was a real learning curve, and a lot of people don't have that kind of intellectual humility to say, actually, I don't really understand what I'm reading here. They just ran with whatever it is. And preprints, in answer to your question, preprints are outside of the traditional journal framework. In days gone by, we used to rely on journals to give some kind of editorial guidance, to assure some quality. And that is still the case for the high quality journals. But there is just an enormous number of predatory journals out there. And so they publish all kinds of rubbish, and often hilariously exposed when people publish complete garbage deliberately and it ends up in a journal. So clearly no human is actually reading some of these papers. Is the preprint sort of model that much of a change from the predatory journal model? Probably not. But it did mean that so much bad quality data was immediately put on. And if you are a journalist without scientific training, if you're just some person, scare quotes, doing their own research, you see some of these things, they're all formatted like papers. They look scientific, they sound scientific, and that's how we ended up with people believing in hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which never had any supporting data, but it was just fraudulent. I mean, it's now found to be fraudulent, not just sort of accidentally factually incorrect. I think it did untold damage, but I don't know if preprints are that unique when you've got a landscape with such bad quality journals already. I mean, there's a common adage that you can find any paper on PubMed, which is the medical database, to support whatever conclusion you want.
You keep preempting my questions, because my next question is, how do you assess journal credibility?
That is a tough one, because sure, there are some well-established journals, the New England Journal and big ones, Journal of the American Medical Association, the British Medical Journal, and so on. But one of the biggest, the second old, maybe the oldest medical journal, which is The Lancet, is the journal that published Andrew Wakefield's MMR study. Retraction Watch is a very valuable website which looks at retracted papers, and I always sort of check it now and again. And if you look at the top 10, A lot of them come from reputable journals. New England Journal of Medicine, PrediMed was a big dietary study which was retracted, and of course the Lancet with the MMR paper. Now, part of that is because they have such a big impact that's why they score highly. So I'm not saying that there's something unique to these big journals, but it just shows that these big journals are also susceptible to errors. So you've got to always bear in mind that everything you read may not be true, because we know of other things like the replication crisis. A lot of published data simply cannot be replicated, particularly in fields like psychology, where it was particularly dramatically exposed. How established a journal is, how reputable it is in the field is important, but again, this is domain-specific knowledge. So I know what it is in internal medicine, I know what it is in cardiology, but if you ask me the difference between the International Journal of Biochemistry versus the British Journal of Biochemistry, I'm just making these titles up, I don't know. Maybe one of them is a predatory journal that was started 2 years ago. Maybe one of them is a very well-established, respected journal. So you can look at things like impact factor. You can obviously, Google the journals and see what people are saying about them, but it's not a perfect science.
Last question, and we may be revisiting some territory here, but say I'm just someone on social media who doesn't know a ton about health. I see, say, Andrew Huberman say this study says this, and he's selling a product along with it. There's a lot of people that do this. What advice would you give to the casual observer of science and health who's interested in the topic, seeing someone saying something about a study? What can they do to assess it in some way that isn't going to take them hours and the sort of understanding that we've talked about during this episode?
Oh, Derek, you've given me that's a hard one. I think, people like Andrew Huberman and the kind of more science-y influencers, I think they're the most damaging and challenging, because when you've got somebody sort of talking about crystals and spirituality, I don't think anybody is mistaking that for some sort of scientific influencer. But when you have people like Andrew Huberman, who uses a lot of jargon, medical the scientific words, and he references papers, this is the number one comment I get every time I am critical of anything he says, is people respond saying, hey, what's the problem with Andrew Huberman? I mean, he cites his studies. And I'm like, that is not enough. You can't, it's just citing studies, as we've already talked about. You can find anything in the literature. So citing studies doesn't lend credibility to somebody. It's good. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, because then at least people can check. But who is going to do that? As you say, it's going to take you hours. So I guess maybe if I had a few general rules of thumb, there's an important concept in medicine, which is your pretest probability. This is to do with sort of Bayesian statistics. What is my prior belief that this thing will have a certain action, whether the kinds of things he talks about are, I mean, who knows? I haven't listened for a little while, but some infrared sauna,
ice baths,
these kinds of, and of course all the supplements he sells. How likely is it that this is going to reduce my likelihood of Alzheimer's or something like that? So if it sounds too good to be true, just because somebody's told you that some study says something, what is your prior assessment? Did you think that was likely 5 minutes ago? Don't change your fundamental sort of assumptions based on a single data point. And then the other one you kind of alluded to, which is where if somebody's selling something, I think you should take whatever they say with a huge pinch of salt, because that is a direct conflict of interest. If an influencer is telling you, like Huberman or Peter Attia, that, getting all these tests done is very important, and it sounds, well, why would you doubt that? But then they pivot into an ad, in Huberman's case, or actually a service that he runs himself in Attia's case, of running all these tests. Why do you trust what they've just said when you can see that there is a direct line to their bottom line, a direct financial incentive for them to promote these things? So I think that is my number one red flag. Maybe my closing response to that would be, is there a scientific consensus to what they're saying? Do other experts in the field agree? Now, part of the appeal of a lot of these people is they're the lone person, the truth teller. And I guess if you're susceptible to that cognitive bias, then it's going to be challenging. Like most people, I think if you're just looking for health advice to make yourself healthy and you're just looking for good information, if somebody's saying something that really isn't supported by the consensus of data, if other doctors or scientists are not in agreement, if they're saying, hang on, this is not supported by evidence. If medical guidelines, which are sort of summaries of available data drawn up by panels of people, if they are in disagreement, I would say unless you have real specific knowledge in the field, I would just ignore it.